When I was little, my father was famous. He was the greatest samurai in the empire. He cut off the heads of 131 lords. He was the greatest samurai in the empire. And he took me.
Hey everybody, as you are all well aware, I put out a video called 11 Questions Flat-Earthers Are Afraid to Answer last year. It languished online for about 7 months and then all of a sudden started to take off. Thousands of comments later, I don't have a great number of answers from Flat-Earthers. My plan was to do a video covering each question and the answers I received, which honestly was a daunting task, and I don't think that's going to happen. Sorry. One reason for this change is the fact that this gentleman, who calls himself the Morgile, decided to put some effort into answering the questions I put forth in my video. And since he holds a little bit of status in the Flat Earther community, I figured I wouldn't get much better representation of the Flat Earther mindset. So I'm going to use him as a vehicle to discuss all the questions right now. So,
hold on to your butts.
It's going to be a long one, which you already know because you can see the time bar. And I want to say right off the bat that watching this guy answer my question was an interesting experience. It was right up there on the D-Marble roller coaster of emotions scale. I apologize in advance for making you go through this whole thing, but that's the only way to deal with this type of infection. You have to cut out the whole thing, which means getting into the weeds and addressing every point. So, take breaks. I will have timestamps in the description so you can bounce to the question you want to see addressed. Okay, let's do this. My video started off with an observation I've often made about Flat Earthers, that they are much more interested in asking questions about the accepted models than they are willing to answer questions about the Flat Earth notion. And he responds to that.
I'd just like to quickly mention, before we start getting into these questions that we're afraid to answer, if we can show that the Earth doesn't have curvature, then it couldn't possibly be a sphere. And by definition, if a surface doesn't have any curvature, and of course it's lumpy, you know, you've got mountains and valleys and rivers and all that stuff, but as a whole, the Earth is shown to be a plane because it doesn't have curvature. I don't know where else you would look other than the ground itself for, you know, large curves, especially over standing water. And if you can't find such curvature on the Earth, then it isn't a sphere. So I don't see any problem with disproving the fact or the notion that the Earth is a sphere. Because if it isn't spherical, then what is left? You know, it is flat. So for scientism religious zealots to claim that we are, for some reason, not allowed to prove that the Earth isn't a ball, really goes to show that they are not interested in science, because the scientific method entails asking questions and trying to debunk standing theories.
So the first thing this guy does is try to lay down a nice base of excuses. He doesn't try to claim that Flat Earthers actually answer questions. He just says attacking the globe is enough. If there is no curve, that's enough. And he says people like me saying that Flat Earthers are not allowed to disprove the globe, we're not interested in science. So where did I say Flat Earthers were not allowed to question the globe? Nowhere. But he's trying to frame a narrative story around me so that he can dismiss what I say. And what I said was that I find that you are more interested in attacking the globe than proving a flat Earth, which you prove in this video. And he says that the scientific method is about trying to debunk standing theories, which is factually incorrect. The scientific method isn't goal-oriented that way. It's about observation, inferring ideas from those observations, and a disciplined methodology in order to test those inferences. It doesn't care about debunking standing theories. That's just you trying to project your goals onto the scientific method. I then go on to say that the questions I have are answerable by current models and the standard model of physics, and this was his reply.
And I would just quickly mention before we get started that we don't necessarily have to have answers for everything. especially not half-baked theoretical answers for everything like the globetards do. Really, our position, the only thing that we must have, and we do have in spades, is proof that the Earth doesn't have curvature, nor is it in any type of motion whatsoever. Beyond that, we don't have to explain what the stars are, what the sun is, what the wandering stars are, what the moon is, and none of that stuff. All we have to do is physically measure the Earth, which means geometry, and test for geological motion, which is physics at its most basic sense. So we really don't need to explain everything. Why
So,
is it?
right off the bat, he's going back to his base excuses. They don't have to have answers because they have a planet with no curve and no motion. And they don't have to have answers about the sun, the moon, the stars, or anything as long as they have that. Now, I'm going to make this point, and I know it will not be the last time I say this. If you make a claim, you need to be able to back it up. You need to be able to support it. If you say the Earth is flat, you have to be able to back it up. If you say the sun is small and local, you have to be able to back it up. If you say the moon is self-illuminating and the stars are on a dome, you have to be able to back those up. The choice is pretty simple. If you don't want to be asked to back up your claim, don't make the claim. Now, you do say that all you have to do is measure and test using geometry and physics, and it's good that you brought that up. I have a feeling we'll come back to that.
Why is it that globeheads seem to think that because they believe they have all the answers to everything, then in order to have a flat Earth, then we must have answers to everything? It's ridiculous. Mainly because, you know, on your side of the argument, you have anywhere from 500 years to a couple thousand years head start, and you have all of the theoretical physics in ink in every textbook ever written for hundreds and hundreds of years, and you think that that somehow supports your position. Well, it may theoretically, but um, you have a pretty big head start.
No, we don't have a head start. We've all been doing this for the same amount of time. What is this? Observing the world around us. We, as a people, have been observing the world since before civilization began, and we all benefit from those observations. The fact is, the flat earth notion has been around longer than the globe understanding has. Just because the majority of people rejected flat earth notions does not mean it couldn't still be researched, but the facts just didn't hold it up. We didn't get a head start. You just fell behind.
And frankly, I think it would be foolish for us to start whipping out answers to things like what are stars made of, or what is the moon, um, because some of these questions, frankly, we can't answer.
I agree that you can't answer these questions. So here's the thing. If you can't answer the questions that naturally stem from your claim, or are unwilling to, then don't make the claim. It's not that difficult.
Sure, we could develop pseudoscientifical agencies like NASA and pretend to have answers and put them in textbooks and force our belief systems onto the toddlers of every generation for hundreds of years. But frankly, I wouldn't do that. And even if we would, um, this is a relatively new topic. It's only been around in the public domain in the modern sense for just a few short years, you know. So, whatever.
Yeah, whatever. I think that sums up your scientific outlook perfectly. Now, next I say that flat earthers want to supplant the current models, globe, solar system, standard model of physics, and listen to his response.
Where do you get your information? Flat earthers want to supplant our model with the globe model and the heliocentric model. No, we're screaming at the top of our lungs from the rooftops that the Earth doesn't have curvature, it's not a sphere, it's not spinning around, it's not orbiting, and this is all demonstrable. This is kind of a big WTF moment for everybody, but for you to say that we want our model to replace everything, that's ridiculous. Sure, we need the model that's being drummed into the heads of all generations of toddlers replaced or stricken from the scientific record because it's just absolute hogwash. But we really, at the end of the day, we need to be scientific about this. We need to be asking the right questions. We need to be measuring the Earth. We need to be performing physical experiments. And at the end of the day, all of this data points conclusively, hands down, to a motionless planar Earth. Now, if you feel that we are somehow trying to replace the globe Earth model, well, you're half right. We need to strike the globe model from our educational systems, and then we'll have a starting point.
He starts off upset, almost offended that I would claim that flat earthers want to replace these models. And then he says, yes, they do want to see them replaced and stricken from the record. Now, in his defense, he only mentions wanting to replace the globe model, but that's only because he's ignorant of the extent of his own claims, which I'll get to in a bit. I then explain what flat earthers need to do in order to be successful in replacing these things. It has to have answers to all the questions that have already been answered by the current models. It has to answer them better than the current models. And it has to answer questions that the current models don't have answers for.
Wait a minute. So you're telling me that not only do we have to answer the questions that your model answers, we have to answer the questions better than your model answers them, and we have to answer questions that your model doesn't answer. That's just absolute nonsense.
Nope, that's how it's done. That's how the current models supplanted the old geocentric models and the old heliocentric models. Remember, heliocentric used to mean that the sun was the center of everything, but that got supplanted because current models answer the same questions even better, and they answer questions the old model can't. I'm not asking you to play by any rules that don't already apply to everyone.
If we can show that the Earth has no curvature, we can show that the Earth isn't in motion, then your model has failed. It's been debunked. It's disproved. It doesn't exist. There is no spinning globe world. And for you to claim that we have to answer all of these questions, that the best your model can do is answer them with theoretical hypotheticals, is just absolute nonsense. The standards that you expect us to adhere to, when all we're doing is pointing out the obvious fact: the Earth is not a ball and it's not spinning and orbiting in space.
And he's back to the all we have to do is show no curvature and no motion.
And space, for all intents and purposes, doesn't exist as you believe that it does. There is no infinitude of galaxies out there in the sky. They're just lights in the sky. Period.
This is the problem with you flat earthers. You want to say all we have to do is prove no curvature, but then you make claims about space not existing. You make claims about what the stars are. You can't back that up, and you think you shouldn't have to. I'm not holding you to a higher standard. You're holding yourselves to a lower standard, and you want people like me to give you a pass. Sorry, you have to use a 10-foot hoop just like the rest of us. Okay, we finally get to the questions. As you know, I asked, where is Venus right now?
Are you being serious right now? What in the world does that have to do with the shape of the Earth? Where is Venus right now? Honestly, how is that question relevant to anything? It isn't. The shape and nature of the Earth have nothing to do with the lights in the night sky. We can come up with theories, but it's totally irrelevant. Sir, measure the Earth. Perform physical experiments to prove this motion that you believe in, and you will, without fail, come up empty-handed every time.
You say that the location of Venus is irrelevant to the shape of the Earth, and I would grant you that if you had never claimed the wandering stars as part of your flat Earth notion. Your flat Earth notion doesn't stop at the shape of the Earth, does it? No, it includes the motion of the Earth, right? And since the shape and the motion of the Earth would affect how we see the universe, You've incorporated the sun, the moon, and the stars as wandering stars. You've included the planets in your claims. So you don't get to say that they are irrelevant, because if they were irrelevant, you should have left them out.
Again, I will say that is 100% irrelevant to the shape and nature of the Earth, but I will pose a question to you, because that's what we flat earthers do, is we just evade your questions and ask other questions, but the actual answer is where Venus is totally irrelevant to curvature or motion of the Earth. But my question to you is, have you ever seen Venus or Mercury after sunset? Because if you have, that is physically impossible in the heliocentric model. You see, just as you said, according to your model, Venus and Mercury's orbital path place them on a tighter orbit than the Earth, which means Venus and Mercury should always be on the day side of the Earth. And the fact that you caught the transit of Venus yourself, that's great. And it was during the day, so that matches your model, sort of. But again, the question is, how is it possible for you to catch a glimpse of Venus or Mercury after sunset?
This is a perfect example of a flat earther not understanding how the real world works. Either that, or he's willing to ignore how the real world works because it fits his narrative. I'll try to make this quick. I was going to use this scale diagram of the planetary orbits, but instead I think I'll just fix this kindergarten level diagram that you put up. First, let me get rid of these distracting moons. Now, is this how you really think things work? Do you think people here can only look straight up? No, silly. The horizon line is drawn as a tangent to the surface. This green area represents the field of view of a person on Earth, their sky. Here, the sun is low in the sky, and now it's just past sunset. It's technically nighttime. So, looking at this diagram, is there anywhere on their orbital paths that would allow Venus or Mercury to be visible after sundown? I'll give you a moment. Yes, these areas here, they would be visible here. Pretty simple. And similar locations can be found for the time just before dawn. It's not that it was impossible, the Morgile, it's just that you didn't understand it. I mean, look at this restaurant menu diagram you used. I mean, did you make this?
And, I would also quickly mention that the fact that we can see Venus with the naked eye debunks your model. Because you see, Venus, according to you, is 24 million miles away at its nearest from the Earth, and 162 million miles when it's furthest from the Earth, with a diameter of only about 7,500 miles. Optically, physically, the angular size of this thing should be too minuscule for us to see with the naked eye.
No, sorry, you misunderstand what the limit of human vision visual resolution means. If an object falls below the range of about 1 arc minute, it doesn't mean it's too small for us to see. It means it's too small for us to resolve any details. So that planet is just a bright dot to us. That's why all the stars and planets look the same with the naked eye, just bright dots. A word to the wise, the Morgile. If you want to use a data point in your favor, you need to learn what that data point means.
But that is really secondary to the main point that Venus should never be visible after sunset. Neither should Mercury. They should strictly be on the day side of the Earth. And so this is just one example of where your model just absolutely falls apart. And it's one of the reasons why we don't have to answer all these questions, because frankly, your answers don't make any sense at all. So why are we held to a higher standard than you? Should we just make something up and put it in textbooks, and therefore we're correct, and follow suit with globe earthers? I don't think so. That's against the spirit of the flat earth community.
Well, I've shown that it fits perfectly within our model, and that you just didn't understand it. And now you're back to your persecution complex about being held to a higher standard. But I'm being held to that same standard, and my model answers your question perfectly. And all you have is excuses. Question 2 was about the rising and setting of the sun and moon.
Well, the simple answer to your question is the fact that it's totally irrelevant. If the Earth doesn't have curvature, nor is it in motion, demonstrably so, then what's happening in the heavens is 100% irrelevant. But the best guess answer, based on what we know, is that the sun and moon are relatively local bodies. They're not hundreds of thousands or millions of miles away, as you believe, but they're relatively close, relatively small objects, if they are even physical objects, and they're traveling more or less along planes of orbit, for lack of a better term.
Again, your problem rears its head. When you make a claim that the info you have says the sun and moon are local, there are questions that stem from those claims that you need to be able to answer.
And from our viewpoint here on the ground, you have two things that cause the rising and the setting of the sun and moon. The first thing is perspective. So, objects that are higher than your line of sight, as they travel away from you, will appear to go down towards the vanishing point, down towards your line of sight. And that's the first part. The second part would be refraction, atmospheric refraction. You see, inbound light from celestial objects or celestial bodies is refracted through the atmosphere, which causes them to appear lower with lateral distance gained from the observer. So again, the two things are perspective and refraction, but frankly, this is all quite irrelevant.
Well, I have a whole video about how perspective doesn't fit the reality of what we see, so I won't repeat it here. But for all the claims flat earthers make about perspective and vanishing points, they never seem to try to explain why the sunrises and sunsets correspond to the longitude position of the viewer, or the fact that if you go up in altitude, you can bring the sun back into view after sunset, or the fact that sunrise starts at the top of mountains first and move down. The globe explains it perfectly, but the flat earth notion doesn't address it at all.
And one question that I would ask to you is, where is the curvature? The other question I would ask to you is, where is the motion?
Okay, curvature. What shall I go with? High altitude balloon video taken by a flat earther with a non-fisheye lens? Rob Skiba started out confident that his demo with two cameras, one with a fisheye lens and one without, would show that the curvature seen was only due to the fisheye lens. But when he got the footage back, he quickly went into damage control mode to claim that there was still lens distortion making it curve. And it was distortion that was coincidentally exactly what the expected curve at that altitude would be. Curve. Earth's motion. How do we gauge the Earth's motion? Well, one thing we can do is make a prediction based on the hypothesis that the Earth is rotating, and then test that prediction. Such is the nature of the so-called pendulum. According to the globe model, the rate of rotation of that pendulum should vary directly in proportion to its latitude on Earth. And that's exactly what is seen. Now, you can claim that these pendulums are fake, but they are very real, and they are evidence of the motion of the Earth. There's no explanation for these pendulums' movement in the flat Earth notion, other than to say, it's fake. So there's your curve, and there's your motion. My next question was about the way sunlight appears on the Earth when projected onto a flat Earth map. This odd shape that doesn't appear to match the way optics work in the real world.
We can get into theory. I mean, none of this proves curvature or motion of the Earth, but it appears that the magnetic field of the Earth, coupled with the atmosphere causing light to refract and bend, this is what causes these patterns, apparently.
Wait. What did you just say?
It appears that the magnetic field of the Earth, coupled with the atmosphere causing light to refract.
What was that based on? What study? What research? What data do you have that tells you this? You don't get to make claims and not be expected to back them up. Your claims bring about more questions than they answer. The Earth's magnetic field does that? This field is powerful enough to change the way light from the sun propagates, but doesn't change the way light propagates anywhere else on Earth? Just the sunlight? Why is sunlight special? What equipment do you use and to measure this uniquely powerful magnetic field, and where have you measured it? You haven't, have you? You made that up. And we all know it. Anyway, I'll let you get back to your excuse making.
I would add, again, that without curvature of the Earth, it couldn't be a sphere, so you really don't have a position here, and I'm really waiting to hear the questions that you ask regarding the curvature of the Earth, because that really is the big one.
Didn't I show curvature a few minutes ago? Okay, well, how about pictures of the entire Earth from space that flat earthers claim don't exist? These are all images taken with film cameras being held by human hands. These are some of the thousands, if not millions, of photos of the full Earth taken by satellites that are updated like every 10 minutes. And they're only fake if you consider all digital images fake, because the same technology that takes those images is being used to record me right now. As for motion, let's go with the scientists at the Technical University of Munich detecting the spin of the Earth using ring lasers back in 2011. Okay, my next question was wondering what the mechanism is that holds and moves the sun and moon in their paths. Let's watch him punt on this one.
Okay, I'm going to go with my standard answer here and state that this question is irrelevant to the shape and nature of the Earth.
Okay, I'm going to stop you again. You made a claim that the sun was small and local. It's part of your flat Earth concept. You made it relevant. But I also won't let you get away with the it's not relevant to the nature of the Earth. Yes, it is. The nature of the Earth is that when people on it look up, they see the sun. It's part of how things are seen from the Earth. So it's very relevant to the nature of the Earth.
But let's look at your answer to this question. You're going to say it's gravity. And gravity is a theory, has never been proven, and has actually been debunked. But your theory is gravity, which somehow binds the planets and the moons in orbits around the sun and around one another and holds everything together. But this force of gravity that you claim and that you believe in doesn't exist. There's no experimental evidence for it. You can point to the Cavendish experiment as your piece of evidence for this, but frankly, sir, matter does not attract other matter, unless you're talking about some sort of magnetic relationship. But you can't demonstrate large conglomerations of dense matter having an attraction to other large, dense conglomerations of matter. And so you have this theory of gravity.
Nope. Gravity is not a theory. It is a known property of matter. It is a measurable force that acts upon matter and is observed on a daily basis. Drop a ball. It falls. Now, the ball moving away from my hand is not evidence of gravity, but the fact that it accelerates away from my hand is evidence. You see, things don't accelerate without force being applied to them. This is basic physics. So if you let an object go and it moved away at a constant velocity, you could make the argument that there is no external force at work. But that's not what happens. It accelerates. Now, I know that flat earthers like to say that whatever works against them just doesn't exist, but this force that you say doesn't exist is wholly predictable, measurable, and detectable. Now, you can say that we can't demonstrate large conglomerations of matter attracting each other, but we can. We can fire satellites near the moon and watch them get pulled into orbit around them. And I know right now you're saying that that's all fake, that's all fake. Shut up. You have no evidence of fakery, but because satellites in orbit blow you out of the water, you have to cry fake. And you may be saying it's never been detected, but again, you would be wrong. It's been detected just like that lovely magnetism you like so much has been. Have you seen magnetism? Has anyone? No. Well, when you put iron filings down, you see the field. No, you don't. You see the iron filings lining up with the invisible field. No, we see the results of magnetism. We see objects get pulled, pushed, and levitate. But these are the effects of magnetism, not magnetism itself. And you are perfectly fine with observing the results of magnetism because you want to use magnetism to your own ends. But since gravity doesn't help you, you have to give it the boot.
You have this theory of infinite space. You have this theory of globular planets and suns in this whole infinitude of vacuum. But so gravity, that's your answer. How does gravity keep the atmospheric pressure of the Earth held fast, adjacent to the infinite vacuum of space? Is gravity now attributed to being structural and tensile material, separating a vacuum from a higher pressure environment? It's absurd. Yet it's written in textbooks, and so you can point to that theory as somehow evidence, but it is not.
This should probably be a video of its own, but since I have no fear of answering questions, I will address this here. Mainly because this is a question that flat earthers need to be able to answer, but can't since they've decided that gravity doesn't exist. Now, hold on, I hear you out there saying that the flat earth notion doesn't have a vacuum of space to deal with, Jerry, so how can you say that? Well, the premise of this claim from flat earthers is that without a solid barrier, low pressure volumes will draw in the air from high pressure volumes. So the vacuum of space would draw the atmosphere right off the planet, which is true if there wasn't some force acting on the atmosphere. And since the flat earth notion doesn't have that force, it needs to be able to explain why there is a high pressure at sea level and low pressure at high altitudes. Now, I know guys like you like to deny things. It's what you do, but there's no denying that there is a difference between the air pressure at sea level and at altitude. So why doesn't the low pressure of the high altitude volume pull the air up from sea level? Without a force like gravity, the flat earth notion has nothing. But even with gravity, some explanation is required. When people think of a vacuum, they think of a vacuum chamber, an extremely low pressure volume near a normal pressure volume, separated by a barrier. When that barrier is removed, the system balances with the high pressure volume rushing to fill the other volume. But the real world doesn't have volumes with this extreme difference in pressure sitting next to each other. It's not black-white like this. It's a gradient. It goes from higher density atmosphere to lower density over a distance of hundreds of miles. There's really no defining border between what we call atmosphere and what we call space. We just picked a spot and said, this is outer space. In our atmosphere, there's no high pressure volume sitting next to a low pressure volume. No, we have a high pressure volume sitting next to a volume that's almost the same, sitting next to a volume that's almost the same, and so on all the way up. There's so little difference between these volumes that there's no force pulling on it that overcomes the pull of gravity. But that's a system that has gravity. Since flat earthers have discarded gravity, they have to find a way of explaining how they can have low pressure and high pressure without them evening out. I next ask why we don't see a different face and phase of the moon in different places on Earth.
You honestly should have named this video 11 irrelevant questions that you believe you have answers to, but have absolutely nothing to do with the shape or nature of the Earth.
The flat Earth notion makes definitive claims about the nearness of the moon. That nearness brings with it basic geometric properties. Remember your claim about using geometry? Yeah, you love geometry when you think it's in your favor. But when you know it slaps you down, it's irrelevant.
Now, in short, the answer to your question is we don't know what the sun and moon are. We don't know how large they are. We don't know how far they are. But for all intents and purposes, it appears that what we're seeing as the sun and the moon are subjective instances that are decoded by our eyes and our minds.
Let me hear that again.
Instances that are decoded by our eyes and our minds.
Are you kidding me? Are you kidding me? Didn't you say earlier that making stuff up was against the spirit of the flat Earth community? You just said that the sun and moon aren't really there and they're just visions in our head. Do you have no idea how absurd that sounds? And you have absolutely zero evidence to support your claim. I mean, seriously, if the sun and moon's positions and appearance are irrelevant to the shape of the Earth, why did you have to come up with this garbage? I'll tell you why. Because you know that these things are connected. The shape and motion of the Earth affects what we see when we look up and when we look out. And changing the Earth being flat and motionless makes nothing we see in the sky make sense. So you have to make something up that you can't prove. More stuff that you can't prove. You are multiplying your unknowns. I've mentioned this before, that you flat earthers are performing a kind of reverse Occam's razor. You all know Occam's razor, right? It's that thing that charlatans refer to when they think science is too hard. Yeah, well, Occam's razor comes down to this. When faced with two equally valid solutions to a problem, the simpler solution is preferred. More specifically, nothing more should be added to a solution than is necessary. More specifically still, you should look to reduce the number of uncertainties in your solution. Reduce the number of unknown factors. Excuse me while I digress a moment. In this case, if we humor the flat earthers and consider it equally valid for a moment, it breaks down like this. Why does the moon, or sun, but we're just talking about the moon here, appear the way it does to people all over the Earth in the globe model? Rising and setting phases and all that. In the globe model, it's determined by the shape and motion of the Earth, distance and motion of the moon, perspective, and refraction, particularly near the horizon. For flat earthers, it's determined by the shape of the Earth, no motion, the distance and motion of the moon, perspective, refraction, atmospheric lensing or magnification. That's why they don't get smaller as they go away, apparently. And now you've added some kind of imaging signal that's somehow sent to and decoded by our brains. On the globe side, we know that what the size of the Earth is and its motion. We know the size, distance, and motion of the moon. We can measure refraction in the atmosphere, and we know how perspective works. Everything is accounted for. Flat earthers don't know how big their Earth is. And don't say you do, the Morgile, because you have more video to go through, and you don't. You don't know specifics about the distance and size of the moon. Perspective is a known value, as is basic refraction. Atmospheric magnification is something you guys made up and don't have any way of measuring. And nobody knows what the hell this is, this magic garbage you came up with. And you just let it fall from your lazy mouth like you were reading a newspaper headline. How do you do that? And why do you even talk about distance or perspective or refraction or magnification if it's all just a vision in your head? None of that matters. What?
And so, more or less, it appears that we're looking at projections. And these projections are given from some source light for the sun, the moon, the stars, and they are rendered into the visual spectrum by the atmosphere or the atmosplane itself. And again, for you to just keep asking these totally irrelevant questions is just so very typical for your people with your position, but it really does get rather tiresome, because I would love to see your evidence for geological curvature and geological motion. And again, this has nothing to do whatsoever with the heavenly luminaries. It has everything to do with basic demonstrable physics, basic demonstrable geometry, and nothing more. We don't have to get into theoretical absurdities.
Dude. You do not get to talk about using basic geometry and physics. Not 30 seconds ago, you said that the sun and moon are projections decoded by our minds. If that's not a theoretical absurdity, then words have no meaning. That was the definitive theoretical absurdity. If you look up those words online, there's going to be a picture of you saying, "The moon is a projection, man." Are you kidding me? He's kidding me, right? It's a joke?
Would you like to point to any experimental evidence that shows curvature of the Earth or motion of the Earth? Because neither of these things exist, and without that, you have no model.
Oh man, he's back on the curvature and motion thing. Okay, let's see. How about all of these pictures of buildings in the distance that are hidden behind the curve of the Earth that no amount of P900 zooming will ever be able to bring back? For motion, how about measurable stellar parallax? That is consistent with an Earth moving a great distance over 6 months, but inconsistent with a stationary Earth and nearby luminaries. Because if the stars were just lights 5, 10, 20,000 miles up, we would see a parallax just going from San Francisco to Paris. But we don't. We only see it when the entire Earth has moved a great distance. Next up, I ask about lunar eclipses and how it works in a flat Earth system. And if it's not the Earth shadow, then what is it?
Frankly, this is just another one of these questions, and I suppose that you believe flat earthers are afraid to answer them, but goodness gracious, why would we waste our time answering questions about your model when you don't even have a physical basis in reality for your model? Again, if the Earth isn't a sphere, and that's provable, and if it's not in motion, which is also demonstrable, then there's no reason to start, grasping at straws to figure out how things work on your model and explain things better when we don't need a model. We're not claiming to have a model. We're simply stating clearly that the Earth isn't a ball.
Okay, I'm going to pause here for a second and point out what I see as a problem with the psyche of this and many flat earthers. He claims to be about facts and science and math and reality, but is thoroughly not interested in exploring reality. No, he shows complete disdain for the concept of developing a clear picture of how things work. He has no problem vomiting complete and utter bull as long as he thinks he can confidently say, "There is no curvature." Actual science means nothing to him.
It's not spinning. And maybe I should stop answering these questions, but okay. So, in terms of a lunar eclipse or eclipses in general, there are major problems with your model, and we don't need to have answers for these because you don't have answers either, and you've got at least a 500-year head start.
As I said, actual science means nothing to these people. Now, his next non-answer is 7 minutes long, but I'm going to let it play and come back later.
Now, one of the biggest problems with eclipses in general is the umbra-penumbra phenomenon, where you have essentially pinpointer converging conical shadows coming from, these spherical objects in space, and unfortunately, nowhere in reality can you demonstrate shadows behaving as such. In reality, an object that obstructs a light source will cast a shadow that is divergent from the obstruction. So you'll have a conical shape that gets wider and wider away from the obstruction and away from the light source. In your theoretical absurd version of reality, you have, and you must have, shadows which converge into a point from the obstruction, which is the opposite of what we see in reality. Now, I will also mention that Eratosthenes' ancient Greek experiment that allegedly proved the circumference of the Earth by measuring the shadow angles of two different locations on the same meridian, triangulating on the sun, and getting the result. That Eratosthenes experiment relies 100% on the inbound light rays from the sun coming in at nearly perfectly parallel angles to one another. Now, unfortunately, you would like to have your cake and eat it too. You want to have the light rays coming from the sun at more or less perfectly parallel angles to one another, but also having the light rays from the sun coming in at convergent angles in order to create a convergent pinpointer stylus-like shadow, which, for example, for solar eclipses, when the moon allegedly transits the sun, causing solar eclipses, the totality of the moon's shadow is usually around 50 or 60 miles in diameter. However, there have been cases on record where the totality, the moon's shadow, was less than 2 miles in diameter. And this doesn't make any sense in your model, again, because Eratosthenes' experiment, which is still a flagship quote-unquote proof of a spherical Earth, uh, must have the sunlight coming in at parallel lines from the sun, but you also must have the sunlight coming in at a convergent angle to create this umbra-penumbra effect, which again, you cannot demonstrate this in reality. When a shadow is cast from an object obstructing a light source, that shadow is going to be equal to or greater than the cross-section of the object which is obstructing the light source. Nowhere in reality can you demonstrate shadows which converge into a point. Only in your theoretical model do you see this, because you must have that to make it work. But again, this contradicts the entire basis for your theory, which is Eratosthenes' experiment way back in Alexandria and Syene a couple thousand years ago. So again, I know it sounds like I'm beating a bit of a dead horse here, but we don't have to answer your silly questions. The Earth doesn't have curvature, it's not in motion, therefore it's not a spinning sphere. Other than that, maybe we need theoretical people to start looking at answers to some of these things, but first, you need to look for the answers, or others need to look for the answers. We can't do it all. And one thing that we simply refuse to do is fill in blanks or fill in unknown values with just absolute nonsense theory. We want to take a zetetic approach to this, which means to proceed with our inquiry only based on what we can prove. Now, I'll just give you another thing that's wrong with the heliocentric model, which is, this whole thing is absurd because the Earth clearly isn't a ball. But your question was, how is the Earth casting a shadow on the moon? And if it's not the Earth's shadow, then what is it? Well, in your model, the moon should technically travel through the shadow of the Earth far more frequently than the moon would apparently transit the sun, according to an observer on Earth. Now, the reason for this is because the Earth's shadow should technically be at least as wide as the Earth itself. Okay, it should. Frankly, it should diverge. The Earth's shadow should diverge from the Earth, going away from the sun. But instead, what we have is, again, this peculiar pinpointer stylus shadow of the Earth going off into space, creating a little pinpoint in space that the moon must hit dead on balls in order to get a lunar eclipse, right? But if you look at a 100-year stretch, there are roughly equivalent number of lunar and solar eclipses, which is just ridiculous in the heliocentric model, because in order to have a solar eclipse, then the moon must transit the sun, and there's only one point that the moon could do this from. But on the other end of this spectrum, in terms of lunar eclipses, the Earth should be casting a wide, divergent conical shadow into space, and the moon should transit this shadow quite frequently. Certainly more frequently than solar eclipses, but again, we see roughly the same number over a 100-year period, and this is just yet another piece of evidence against your model. But again, to answer your question, if the Earth is demonstrably not a sphere, and I challenge you to produce one shred of physical evidence to show that the Earth is a sphere, then there's no point in answering your question. We don't know what causes lunar eclipses. Now, it could be something along the lines of a Faraday effect, could be something along the lines of a Rahu and Ketu heavenly body that is not within the visible spectrum that transits the moon during lunar eclipses. But again, until the Earth is shown to be spherical, then there's absolutely no point in trying to answer these questions in a flat Earth model, because we frankly need to get the world on board with this scientific inquiry first, and then we'll start answering these questions later. Again, we refuse to just start pulling stuff out of our asses and writing it into textbooks, forcing it down the throats of all generations of toddlers, and then calling it fact. That is not how science is done.
Okay, that was a whole lot of nothing. Let's work backwards. He says pulling stuff out of your ass isn't how science is done. Yet, as we have seen, he is perfectly happy with pulling stuff out of his ass. And you know how science isn't done?
We don't need to have answers for these because you don't have answers either.
Let's see. You say there shouldn't be about the same amount of lunar eclipses as there are solar eclipses because the moon shadow is small and the Earth shadow is big. And it should hit the moon more often. Except for the fact that the Earth is really big so that the moon shadow has a bigger target to hit. Bet you never thought of that. Moving on, and before that you said that the conical shadow of the umbra-penumbra effect never happens in the real world. Yeah, it kind of does. All the time. When the light source is bigger than the object, light comes around and lightens the outer shadow, leaving a darkened area in the center. I put this little demo together for you. As you can see, the larger light source and the smaller object causes an umbra-penumbra effect here. And go outside. The sun, though you think is small, it is actually bigger than every object on Earth. So when you look at the shadows, they aren't sharp. There is an umbra-penumbra effect going on. And what else? Eratosthenes. Is it convergent or nearly parallel? Which is it, huh? Which is it? Which is it? Dude, you just said it yourself. Nearly parallel. And what does that mean? Convergent. Oh, I know you have pictures that aren't to scale that exaggerate the convergence, but we're talking 93 million miles, so mildly convergent. Nearly parallel. Those are not contradictions, which you would know if you bothered to think about it for more than a second or two. Oh, and you just threw in the idea of there being an invisible celestial body that somehow makes lunar eclipses happen, which I think is called
pulling stuff out of our asses.
Moving on. Question 7 was about the solar eclipses, how they work in a flat Earth universe, and why the shadow of the moon is not bigger than it is given how close it is to the sun in their view. The Morgile, of course, began with his go-to position.
Okay, so that was sort of a 3 or 4 part question, but again, all irrelevant, all having nothing to do whatsoever with the shape of the Earth, nothing to do with the motion of the Earth. You believe you have answers for this, and so you believe you're correct, but let's just go through these really quickly. How does a solar eclipse happen? Well, it appears that the moon may be transiting the sun, according to observers on Earth, although it may be something else. I believe that there's enough evidence to support the notion that the moon is transiting the sun, according to an observer on Earth. Although other flatties may disagree with me, I think that there is enough evidence to at least say that that's possible.
Wait, what? Did you say that there is enough evidence that for you to say that the moon is transiting the sun? But how? That would make the moon a physical thing that is going in front of a light source. Just a few minutes ago, you said that the sun and moon appear to be subjective instances that are decoded by our minds. Dude, which is it?
Now, you said that flat earthers claim that the sun and moon are the same size and on the same plane. I don't know any flat earthers who claim that.
I'm going to stop you here again because it's another example of what's wrong with your thinking. I did not say that flat earthers claim that. All models I've seen of the flat earth that have the sun and the moon in them, I spoke of the models that I have seen. Do you not recognize the difference? Of course you don't, because you, like so many of your companions, only hear what you want to hear, and so you've turned this simple fact of my experience with FE models into something you can attack.
I think it's safe to say that if the sun and moon are physical objects, then they are of similar size and along a similar plane. However, the relative size of the sun and moon varies. That's how you get total eclipses. That's how you get annular eclipses. So there is a bit of a variable in terms of the angular size of the sun and moon.
Wait, so now the relative size of the sun and moon vary? So not only do you not know where the sun and moon are,
We don't know how far they are.
or how big they are,
We don't know how large they are.
but you say that they are variable. Where's your evidence of that? Let me guess. Irrelevant? And again, if you say the size of the sun and moon change, and that determines the different eclipses, then you're saying that the sun and moon are objects. And you've already said that you don't know they are objects, just a few moments ago. It sure does seem a lot like the rules of your universe change depending on what question you're trying to answer. And it doesn't matter if there's a contradiction from the last answer because you're here now and this is your answer. Say what you want about the accepted models, but the same rules apply everywhere. How much gravitational force is being applied to the moon? This much. To a bird? This much. Every time.
So your question or your depiction, your caricature of flat earthers' beliefs is false. I mean, that's a running theme with globeheads, is creating straw man caricatures of the flat earth proponents' ideas and then shooting those caricatures down. But again, that's not how science is done.
Straw man? You know, a straw man is when you impose a position on your opponent that they didn't take in order to attack it more easily. Where's the straw man here? You see, I didn't say that that was the position of flat earthers, did I? Nope, I spoke of the models I've seen, which is true. You, on the other hand, have just set up a position that I didn't take in order to attack it easily. So, ironically, in order to claim that I was attacking a straw man, you had to create a straw man to attack. How awesome was that? And you didn't even notice it, did you? Even now, your weaselly little brain is trying to figure out how to not have done what you've done. But there it is.
We don't claim that the sun and moon are of the same size. We don't claim that they are on the same planes of orbit, for lack of a better word. But I think it's safe to assume that they are of a similar size and orbiting, for lack of a better word, upon a similar plane to one another.
And after that, after complaining falsely that I created a straw man, you say, we don't think that they are the same. We just think that they're similar.
But that doesn't mean anything. I mean, this is all very, very, very far down the line. The first thing that we have to do is measure the Earth, test it for motion, and until you can find evidence for sphericity, curvature, motion, then all of these points are 100% moot. Now, you also said, how does the moon pass in front of the sun without interacting with it? We don't know. It's irrelevant. We don't know what the sun is. We don't know what the moon is. So to say that, how is this possible? How is that possible with the sun and the moon? Is it so bad to say we don't know? Because, again, we're not going to just start making crap up and writing it down in textbooks, forcing it down the throats of all generations of toddlers, and then call it fact.
Hey. Don't get me wrong. I think saying you don't know is great. But you also need to be consistent. In this video, you've said that the sun and moon are small and local, which means they are things with a position and size. You've said you don't know how big they are or where they are. You've said that they are subjective and decoded by our minds. You've said that the moon does go in front of the sun for eclipses, making them real things again, and that those objects vary in size throughout the year, and now you're back to you don't know. If you don't know, fine. Just don't make a claim as if you do. And I've noticed you repeat this phrase a lot. You're not going to start making crap up and writing it down in textbooks. And I'm beginning to think that you have a problem with textbooks, because you definitely have no problem with making stuff up. So it's gotta be the textbooks. You also talk a lot about shoving things down toddlers' throats a lot. What's up with that?
It's not how we do it. The final thing, and I love that you asked this question, During a solar eclipse, how does the shadow of the moon cover such a small area? Well, I would love to hear your answer for that, because I already know what your answer is. You're going to bring up the whole umbra penumbra thing with this um, convergent pinpointer peculiar shadow angle that causes the moon's shadow to taper down into a point as it reaches the earth. But that is not how shadows behave in reality. Now, you can take that position, but then again, that wipes out Eratosthenes' experiment that is a flagship cornerstone of the heliocentric theory, and you can't have both. Your very own theory contradicts itself by Eratosthenes' assumption that the Earth is a sphere and that the sun's rays are coming in at parallel lines to one another. That absolutely 100% contradicts the theory behind the umbra penumbra phenomenon. But see, you have to make that up from your position, because in reality we do indeed see a very teeny tiny, usually 50 to 60 mile diameter shadow of the moon during a total solar eclipse. Now, in your model, uh, you've put yourself in checkmate, because you have to have this umbra penumbra phenomenon. Yet again, it contradicts Eratosthenes' assumptions, which is a cornerstone of your theory. So which is it? Is the sun's rays coming towards the Earth at nearly perfect parallel angles, or are the sun's rays coming towards the Earth at convergent angles to cause this peculiar phenomenon where shadows taper off into a point as they gain distance away from the obstruction, which cannot be demonstrated in reality? Which is it? How is the shadow of the moon covering such a small area during total solar eclipses? Your model doesn't have an answer for that.
Okay. You were a bit repetitive there, but I wanted to let you repeat that weak position a couple more times just to drive it home how wrong you are. Now, I already went over this, but just to recap, Mr. Morgile here says that the shadows don't work this way in reality. He says it very defiantly.
Which cannot be demonstrated in reality.
But yes, they do. Here's my demo again. You can see the umbra penumbra effect. Now, this works because of the relationship between the size of the light source and the object, and the distances between them and the surface. Watch the size of the effect change as I move the objects around. Now watch what happens when the light source is just a bit bigger than the object, and when the distance between them becomes small. This is why the darkest part of the shadow should be much bigger on a flat Earth. Since we're being repetitive, you are once again wrong about light traveling in nearly parallel lines and also being convergent somehow being a contradiction. I'll make it simple for you, JC. These lines are parallel. They will not converge. Now, these lines are nearly parallel. Guess what? They will converge. You can have both. Is that clear enough for you? Question number 8 was, why do the sun and moon have spherical shapes? What forces give them those shapes, and why don't they apply to the Earth, with the alternate question of, how do lunar phases work if you don't think they are actually spherical?
Why do all of your questions have absolutely nothing to do with the Earth at all? Really. First of all, your assumption is that the sun and moon are spherical objects. If I grant that to you for argument's sake, let's say hypothetically the sun and the moon are spherical, how does that relate to the Earth itself? The answer is it doesn't. Only in your mind is there a connection between these heavenly luminaries and the physical plane which we all live on. The Earth is nothing akin to the heavenly luminaries, nothing like the sun or the moon. So even assuming that the sun and the moon are spherical objects in space, that does not make the Earth a spherical object in space, because frankly, sir, the sun and the moon are simply not the Earth.
Okay. No, it's not an assumption on my part, because it's not true that the Earth is nothing like the sun and the moon. You may want to deny it, but we have been observing the sun and the moon for thousands of years and capturing them on film for decades. And we know for a fact that they are spherical. Watching them closely, we see they have all the properties of real objects that are spherical in shape. The way the surface details change and distort around the outer areas compared to the center. And since their distances from the Earth change over time, these surface details change due to perspective, just as they do with all other physical objects. You say that it's only in my mind that there is a connection between them and the physical plane which we all live on, which is interesting because you've changed the rules yet again. You've said that perspective applies to them. You've said that refraction applies to them. You've said that the moon goes in front of the sun. You've said that they are near to the Earth. These are all properties of the physical plane which we all live on. And you are perfectly happy to refer to them when they suit you. But you want to discard them when they don't. You see, there are certain assumptions that are made when it comes to the sun and the moon. It's an assumption that is absolutely necessary for any scientific research to be of any value. And that is the assumption that the universe is rational. That the laws of physics, the rules that govern things in the universe, the math, the geometry that you like to mention so much, they apply everywhere. They don't just apply when it's convenient for us. So when we see the sun and the moon present the same properties as all the other real objects that we observe, it is perfectly valid to consider them real objects. Otherwise, we're just making stuff up, and that's not real science. Now, question 9 was a bit cruel of me. I asked what powers the sun. And I asked this question to see how deeply flat earthers contemplate the ramifications of their claims. If you change the status of the sun, you need to be able to explain it, or at least understand that an explanation is going to be needed. But the Morgile here can't even manage to show that basic understanding. What he does is attack the accepted science with his own ignorant claims and shows absolutely zero intellectual curiosity about how things work.
It's just so redundant. Let's start by answering the question with what you believe. You believe that the whimsical theory of hot atomic fusion is powering the sun. Now, first of all, you cannot demonstrate hot atomic fusion in reality. It is a theoretical absurdity. And then your second explanation has to do with this push and pull of gravity, which is yet another theoretical absurdity. So if it's okay for you to answer these questions in your model with just absolutely theoretical, non-demonstrable, absurd notions, we're not going to stoop to that level. Again, the best answer to this question is we do not know what powers the sun, and it is completely irrelevant to the shape of the Earth. Furthermore, just because you believe that hot atomic fusion and gravity are what powers the sun doesn't make it so. Never in a million billion years is anyone going to travel to the sun and scoop up a sample, bring that back for testing. Okay? Now, also, if hot atomic fusion could be demonstrated in reality, which it can't, there is absolutely no correlation between that and the sun.
Okay, let me step in here. You say that hot atomic fusion is a theoretical absurdity and cannot be demonstrated in reality. So is it safe to say that you don't believe thermonuclear bombs exist? You know, the hydrogen bomb? Because those are fusion bombs. Is there a vast worldwide conspiracy to lie about the mechanism of the H-bomb? Because that's something else you'd have to prove. The H-bomb is real-world, lab-tested evidence of hot atomic fusion. And yes, I know that the H-bomb is not only a fusion reaction, that it's kickstarted by fission, but that doesn't negate the fact that it is fusion being observably produced. And you say, well, even if there was proof for the concept of fusion, there is, you say there is no correlation between that and the sun. And you would have a point if no one bothered to study the data received from thermonuclear explosions, the type of particles emitted, the electromagnetic radiation signatures that result from these types of reactions. If no one did that, and no one studied the sun on, say, a daily basis, collecting data and comparing it to past findings, then yeah, you might have a point. But since we have that data, and we have to assume the universe is rational, we can say that there is a correlation between that and the sun.
Okay. Furthermore, you say that the sun and gravity needs this large, dense mass and fuel in order to work. So now we're going to say that hydrogen and helium are large, dense conglomerations of mass, because that's what you believe it is. Some of the lightest gases known to humans are supposedly what's in the sun. This is just absolutely absurd, but that's what we're up against. As flat earthers, we're up against people who have deeply rooted belief systems in theoretical absurdities that have been taught to them their entire lives.
And those of us who have an understanding of actual science have to deal with the fact that flat earthers like yourself have a horribly simplistic understanding of scientific subjects. You ask if I'm saying hydrogen and helium are large, dense conglomerations of mass, which again is you filtering what I said through the lens of ignorance and bias. I didn't say that hydrogen and helium are large conglomerations of mass. I said the sun is made up of a large conglomeration of mass, made up of hydrogen and helium and other elements. But you can't tell the difference between those statements, can you? Because in your mind, hydrogen and helium are always in this gaseous state, filling balloons that rise in the air. You can't think beyond that to the fact that if you get more and more of it into a small volume, the density of that volume increases. And it doesn't matter how light an atom of hydrogen is, if you get enough of it in one place, it is a lot of mass. No, in your kindergarten party balloon understanding of science, hydrogen and helium will always be this light, airy substance.
And we're supposed to combat this absolute ignorance with the blunt answer, we don't know, yet it is irrelevant. Because again, without curvature to the Earth, without motion of the Earth, you don't even have a physical basis for your model. We don't need a model. We don't need to answer these questions. All we need to do is show that the Earth has no curvature, no motion, period, end of story. The Earth is not a spinning ball.
As you can see, he didn't even make the slightest attempt to answer the question, or even acknowledge that these questions need to be answered. No, understanding these things don't matter to him. Flat earthers don't need to have a model, which is a great scientific attitude, by the way, as long as they can say that there's no proof of curvature or motion. So, for proof of curvature, shall I go with Wolfie's drone footage of a sunset that gets reversed when he makes the drones go higher? Or this drone footage of a skyline appearing and disappearing with its altitude changes? And for evidence of motion, I think I'll put up the actual Coriolis effect. Not the toilets flushing nonsense, but the actual Coriolis effect, which is demonstrable, reproducible, and cannot be explained at all on the stationary Earth. Question 10 was, what forces are stopping people from going to the other side of the Earth, other than worldwide conspiracies to stop the travel? Now, most people who answered this question just said that there was a conspiracy to stop travel and that there are troops stationed down by an ice wall to stop people. The Morgile had a very different take.
The other side of the Earth. I'd really love to know what you mean by the other side of the Earth. And I know that I've been probably a little bit disrespectful in this video response, but I got to tell you, we've been dealing with people with your position for years now, and the problem is that you try to marry the heliocentric belief system with the flat Earth reality, and the two are just completely incompatible with one another. The flat Earth does not exist in a heliocentric universe. In fact, infinite space, as we've been brainwashed to believe in for our entire lives for several generations, infinite space, for all as we can tell, doesn't exist. The lights in the night sky are merely lights in the night sky.
Okay, just a brief stop here. You keep saying that my questions had nothing to do with the shape of the Earth. Yet you just made a claim, and you did it several times in your responses, about a bunch of things that have nothing to do with the shape of the Earth. Space, the planets, the stars, all of those supposedly have nothing to do with the shape of the Earth, and you shouldn't have to answer anything about them. Yet they are a part of your flat Earth universe, and you keep making statements about them. If you're going to bring it up, expect people to call you on it. No special treatment for you.
We don't have to have explanations for what they are, but it is very clear that the Earth is not a disk or like a giant coin shape flying around in space.
It's not a disk? Great. Talk to your people, because a lot of them think it is. They make drawings of it and everything. So have your community take care of its business.
The Earth is a motionless plane, and in fact, I think it's better stated that the Earth is the motionless plane. So the Earth is the physical plane, and everything in the sky is above us. There is no other side of the Earth, as in other side of a coin.
So you're saying the Earth is it. There's the Earth and the sky above it. Okay, I can picture that. It brings up more questions, but you wouldn't answer them anyway. Again, you're making claims that affect more than just the shape of the Earth. But we've been down that road.
There are no forces preventing this. You simply can't travel. Let me put it to you in something you can understand. Why haven't you traveled to the center of the spherical Earth? Why haven't you gone down there? What forces are preventing you from going to the center of the spherical Earth? Well, you could say molten lava. You'd probably say gravity. I don't know. But the point is that it's quite irrelevant. But it is something that is impossible.
No. It's not irrelevant. You said there are no forces at work, and you just can't. And then tried to make a comparison to travel to the center of the Earth like it was a similar thing. And then you bailed because I think you noticed it was a bad analogy. But you did ask me that question. What forces prevent travel to the center of the Earth? Well, let's see. The Earth's center is some 4,000 miles down. And we don't have a device with the ability to dig for 4,000 miles. We have no way of powering such a thing over such a distance. And then there's pressure. As you go down, you have the mass of all the atmosphere above you pushing down. And if you did it through the bottom of the ocean, you'd have all that water crushing down on you too. These are natural forces that are directly related to the substance and shape of the Earth and the laws of physics. But you say there are no forces stopping you, and there is no other side, so...
Now, there probably is more land if you keep going, south or away from the North Pole, or just travel in a straight direction and just keep going straight for, say, 10,000 miles. There's probably more land out there.
Okay, so my question automatically turns to why has no one kept going to the other land out there? You just said there's no forces stopping you. And you say there's no infinite space, but it sure does sound like you're saying there's infinite land.
You're not going to travel off the edge of the Earth if you go in a straight line in any direction. More than likely, you're going to keep going and possibly find other quote-unquote solar systems along the plane. And by solar system, I mean, an area that has a sun and maybe a moon and stars in the sky.
But you're not going to just make stuff up, right?
And, as far as we can tell, this is an electromagnetic phenomenon. Has nothing to do with the theory of hot atomic fusion.
So the sun is a small, nearby, subjective instance of an electromagnetic phenomenon that is decoded by our brains and is governed by perspective and refraction, changes size, and can be occluded by the moon, which may be a similar phenomenon. And if you go far enough south, there are probably more of them out there. And that's you only talking about what you can prove through real science? Okay.
But, you know, why haven't we traveled to the other side of the Earth? These questions are just absurd. Why haven't you traveled to the center of the Earth? Right? Why haven't you traveled to the edge of space?
Me personally? Because I don't have the money or the connections. But people have, and devices constructed by people have. And you can choose not to believe it, but that's you. And that's the difference between our two situations. You ask why we haven't gone, and I show you evidence of the fact that we have, and you don't accept it. I ask why you haven't gone to the other side of the Earth, and you say it's because there is no other side. The land just keeps going on. And then you just breeze on by what is the obvious next question, which is why has no one gone out to there?
Because such a thing is not possible. You can't travel to the other side of the Earth that doesn't exist. I mean, you could dig for 10,000 miles and maybe run into a bunch of molten lava, but you're not going to travel over the edge and down around under the bottom of the Earth because we're not on a disk in space. That's 100% certain. And, you know, I really hope and pray that intelligent people such as yourself are able to look at this whole phenomenon of reality objectively, scientifically, unbiased, without prejudice, and without preconceived notions, and simply practice the scientific method.
Why are you talking about the scientific method? Not one of the answers you bothered to give showed any practice of the scientific method. Not one. You didn't even show any respect for the need to explore for answers.
Which involves conducting physical experiments to either prove or disprove held beliefs, or maybe things that you don't wish to believe.
You speak of testing what you believe, but you're not even willing to consider the questions that naturally stem from what you believe.
But, you know, to throw these questions out as if you have answers to them in your model, which you don't, is just absurd. You know, so you tell me, why haven't you traveled to the center of the Earth, or what forces are preventing you from doing that? And you can clone stamp that right onto the flat Earth. So if you say it's lava, then I'll tell you lava.
So now you're just blatantly displaying your intellectual laziness by saying you'll answer my question with whatever answer I have to your question. I guess we all know now how you got through science class without actually learning anything. And then we get to my last question. We all know what the Morgile's response will be. So, in your opinion, what is the most sophisticated model of a flat Earth system, and where can I find it? I look forward to seeing your answers.
Well, I suppose that question has already been answered ad nauseum in this video, but I'll go ahead and answer it one final time. The most sophisticated model of the flat Earth is, drumroll, irrelevant, because we don't need a model. All we need to do is simply measure the Earth, and astonishingly enough, we find time and time again that there is no geological curvature. Now, you can have all fancy pants models about what the heavenly luminaries are doing, apparently according to little observers here on Earth, but that doesn't make the Earth a sphere. I'll just tell you, you can track the, you know, quote-unquote orbital paths of the wandering stars. And by the way, NASA is a liar and space probes don't exist. And apply that to any model. the models are based on observation and documentation, very meticulous, long-term, over the centuries, observation and documentation of what's going on in the sky. And that can be applied to any model. But, the most sophisticated flat Earth model is irrelevant. Okay, at this point in time, what we need to do is show people that there's no curvature to the Earth, it's not spinning around, and then we can allow the theoretical physicists to do their thing and start looking for answers to these questions. But, frankly, I don't even think we need to get them involved, because they've done just a terrible job up to this point, convincing themselves and then force-feeding all generations of toddlers to follow suit with their beliefs. So hopefully, if you've gleaned anything from this video, is the fact that the Earth is indeed flat and stationary. Much to our surprise, that is the case. And most importantly, we don't have to have an explanation for everything. Why is it that humankind believes that we have to have detailed explanations and models for everything when apparently, at this point in time at least, with our current technology and our current worldview being just so absurdly backwards, such a thing is not possible.
What I have gleaned from this video is that you have nothing but disdain for the scientific method that you hide behind. You practically show disgust for the idea of having physicists study your universe. I learned that you don't think beyond the current question you're trying to answer, and you don't care if your current answer conflicts with your last answer. I've learned, no, that's not correct. You've confirmed with me that every criticism that flat earthers have of the globe model and the solar system is based on their ignorance of the subjects. You didn't understand the orbital path of Venus. You didn't understand what the limit to human visible angles meant. You didn't grasp how shadows work in the real world. You didn't grasp that near parallel and convergent was not a contradiction. You didn't seem to grasp that H-bombs are atomic fusion, and that a volume of helium and hydrogen can be dense and massive. And I've learned, once again, you've confirmed that many flat earthers are fine with ignorance. You don't know, you don't need to know, and you're not even curious to try to know. And yet you claim you're all about the scientific method. And lastly, I learned that all you have, and literally all you want to have, is, where's the curve? And so, for my last point, I want to discuss the image that you used over and over again throughout your video. This one here, which was a photograph that set the world record for landscape at a distance. You obviously used it because you think it is evidence for the flatness of the Earth, but in fact, it is not, because the method used to capture this photograph is evidence of the Earth's curvature. If you bothered to go to the website of the photographer, you could read up on how they research and prepare to capture these types of images and all the long-distance images that they take. In short, they use refraction. They understand that the distance peaks are actually below the horizon and under most circumstances will not be visible. But they visit these sites repeatedly. They monitor the weather conditions and they gauge the refraction levels and they determine when the opportunity for a good distance shot would develop. This is an understanding of the curve of the Earth, of optics, and it's the scientific method in action. Well, that's it. Before I sign off, I want to say thank you to the Morgile for having the gumption to put himself on the record with his non-answers to most of my questions. The reason I make these videos is not to convince flat earthers of the error of their ways. No, I do this because I think critical thinking is important, and flat earthers like yourself provide excellent examples of poor critical thinking in action. You were excellent. And to everyone who made it to the end, congratulations. This was a doozy. But I have to admit, this was fun.
That's my job! That's what I do! I don't lose! I win!
Hey everybody. As you are all well aware, I put out a video called 11 Questions Flat Earthers Are Afraid to Answer last year. It languished online for about 7 months, and then all of a sudden, it started to take off. Thousands of comments later, I don't have a great number of answers from flat earthers. Why are these birds making so much damn noise? Hold on.
That's my job. That's what I do. I don't lose. I win. I win. Is there no one on this planet to even challenge me?
Maybe you came by to congratulate me on last night's victory.